Have you ever gone through a moment when everything seemed to fall apart, and no matter how much you cried out to God, the answer didn't come? Days, months, maybe even years, waiting for a sign, an open door, a solution, and nothing. God's silence can be one of life's most difficult trials, and it is exactly in these moments that faith is tested, that the heart is confronted, and that many come to ask themselves, if God loves me, why does he allow me to go through this? Testing often comes like an unexpected storm. You're walking normally, trusting that everything is under control, and suddenly the winds change, doors close, resources run out, people disappoint you. What was once certain becomes uncertain, and the only thing that remains is doubt. Has God forgotten me? Is he really listening to my prayers? But what most people don't realize is that the test is never the end. She is a preparation. The desert has never been a place of death, but a place of transformation. God does not test us to destroy us, but to strengthen us. Waiting may feel like a punishment, but it's actually a time of construction, a time where God is working behind the scenes, shaping your heart, setting the stage for something greater than you ever imagined. And here's the big question. What do you do when God seems to be silent? Do you give up? Do you rebel? Or do you trust that, even without seeing it, God remains in control? Today, you will understand why does God allow trials before miracles. And more than that, you will realize that waiting time is not wasted time. It is the time where God is building the greatest victory of your life. Now tell me, have you ever faced a time when it seemed like God was silent? Write in the comments and share your experience, because your story can strengthen someone who is going through the same process. What if I told you that everything you are experiencing now is part of a much greater purpose? That the pain, waiting, and tears are not the end of your story, but just the beginning of something extraordinary that God is already preparing. Many people give up in the middle of the process because they can't see beyond the present moment. But God never works without a purpose. The truth is, the times are speeding up. The trials are getting more intense. The spiritual struggles are getting stronger. And those who are not prepared may be caught by surprise. The world is collapsing, and all of this has already been announced in the Word of God. But the question is, are you spiritually ready for what's to come? This video did not come to you by chance. God wants to strengthen you, teach you to trust the process, to understand that before the miracle, there is always a time of trial. But what do you do in that time? Do you walk away? Do you rebel? Or do you stand firm, knowing that God never fails? Often, when we are going through trials, we feel as if we are surrounded by a whirlwind of problems with no apparent way out. The weight of the difficulties seems overwhelming. Doors that were once open begin to close, opportunities disappear, plans fall apart, and hope fades. The heart wonders, God, where are you? Why is this happening to me? The feeling of loneliness becomes almost unbearable. Friends move away, answers don't come, and it seems like no one understands the pain we are feeling. Every day that passes without a solution feels like an extra weight on your shoulders. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt like your prayers were being ignored? That no matter how much I cried, God remained silent? But what many don't realize is that while everything seems to stand still in the natural world, behind the spiritual scenes, God is acting in powerful ways. God never stops working, never stops listening, never stops responding, but he acts differently than we expect. His time is not like ours, and his ways are greater than we can comprehend. Think of a theater. When the curtains are closed, it appears as if nothing is happening on stage. But behind the scenes, the sets are being prepared, the actors are getting into position, the costumes are being adjusted, everything is being aligned for the big moment when the curtains will open. This is also the case with God's actions. Just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean nothing is happening. The problem is that in the midst of the storm, our vision is limited. All we can see are the gigantic waves around us, the strong winds, the sound of thunder. Fear takes over, anxiety grows, but it is exactly in these moments that God invites us to trust, because true faith is not believing when everything is fine, but believing even when there are no visible signs of an answer. And do you know why God allows this? Because it is in these moments that our faith is shaped. God never wastes a trial. He uses every difficulty to strengthen us, to teach us, to prepare us for something greater. What seems like a time of loss can actually be a time of growth. What seems like a phase of abandonment may be the soil where God is planting the seeds of a future you cannot yet imagine. Now stop and think. How many times after a big fight have you looked back and realized that God was in control the whole time? How many times has what seemed like a defeat ended up becoming the greatest learning of your life? Perhaps today you are facing such a test. Perhaps the doors are closed, the resources are exhausted, the answers are slow to arrive. But I want to remind you of something very important. God's silence never means absence. He may be silent, but he never stops acting. What you see as a delay could in fact be God aligning everything so that the answer arrives at the right time. And that brings us to a very important question. What do you do while you wait? Do you despair or continue to trust? Do you complain or hand everything over to God? Write in the comments. Have you ever had a time when God seemed to be silent, but then you saw that He was always in control? Share your experience, because your story could be the strength someone needs to continue believing today. Don't ignore this call. If this message has already touched your heart, leave your like right now so that more people are reached by this word. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving messages that strengthen your faith and prepare you for the challenges that lie ahead. And more than that, share this video with someone who is facing a big test. This message could be exactly what that person needs to hear today. God has a purpose, and He uses people like you to spread hope and transformation. The waiting is difficult. God's silence hurts. Each day that passes without an answer seems like an eternity. Each unreturned prayer weighs on the heart. Time seems to drag by, and uncertainty eats away at the soul. Is God really listening? The mind fills with doubts. The heart tightens, and thoughts begin to question everything that was once certain. What if nothing changes? What if my prayer is never answered? What if I'm waiting in vain? God's silence is one of the greatest challenges of the journey of faith. When we are facing battles, our first reaction is to ask for an immediate response. We want quick solutions, visible changes, concrete signs. But God, in His infinite wisdom, works in a different way. Before transforming the circumstances around us, He works within us. This waiting process, however painful it may be, is not a punishment. It's training. God never delays without a reason. He never allows proof without a purpose. But why does He push us to the limit? Why does He allow us to go through moments when everything seems to be against us? The answer is simple and, at the same time, profound. God wants to teach us to trust Him completely. Waiting hurts because it confronts us with our own limitations. When everything is fine, we trust what we can see, what we can control. But when God puts us in a period of silence, He is teaching us that true faith does not depend on what we feel, but on what we choose to believe. Remember the story of Abraham. God promised that he would have a son, but time passed, and the promise seemed more and more distant. It was years of waiting. With each day that passed without a sign, Abraham had to decide whether to trust God or let doubt take over. And that is the same choice we face today. God does not work on our anxiety. He works on our confidence. He does not move in our despair, but in our faith. Many times, He takes us to the point where we no longer have any human way out, precisely so that we can understand that He is the only answer. Maybe you're wondering, but why does God need to test me? Doesn't He already know my heart? Yes, God knows all things, but the trial process is not for God. It is for us. We are the ones who need to learn to trust, to rest, to depend entirely on Him. The test reveals who we really are. When everything is well, it's easy to praise, it's easy to be grateful, it's easy to believe. But when the days become difficult, when prayers seem unanswered, when difficulties increase, that's when our faith is tested. And that's why, before a great miracle, God always works in the invisible. He shapes our hearts, teaches us to persevere, shows us that His presence does not depend on what we feel, but on what we know about Him. Think about the story of Joseph. He had a great dream, but before seeing his promise come true, he went through years of injustice, betrayal, and imprisonment. He could have given up, he could have rebelled, he could have questioned God, but he remained faithful, because I knew that God was in control, even when everything seemed to go wrong. Now, think about your life. How many times have you had moments when you didn't understand what God was doing, but then you realized He was working the whole time? How many times, in the end, did everything make sense? Waiting hurts because it teaches us to give up control. It teaches us to trust when we see no way out. It teaches us to rest in the certainty that God is never late, but acts at the exact time. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a period of waiting that seemed endless, but then you saw that God was preparing something bigger? Share your experience in the comments. Your testimony could be the answer someone needs to continue believing today. The pressure reaches the limit. The heart is tired. The mind is overloaded. And the body no longer has the strength to continue fighting. Everything seems lost. Prayers seem to go through the roof, and God's silence becomes unbearable. Desperation knocks on the door, and doubt whispers in the ear, "Has God forgotten me?" The days drag on, the nights become long, and hope weakens with each frustrated attempt at a solution. The world seems to continue spinning normally for everyone, except for those who are going through the test. What once made sense now seems distant. Promises seem forgotten, dreams seem unattainable, and the only certainty that remains is pain. This is when many give up, when everything around says there is no way out, when human efforts are not enough, when God's silence seems like a sentence of abandonment. Many can't stand the weight. Many let themselves be carried away by fear. Many believe that the end has arrived. But it's exactly there, at the deepest point of despair, that God begins to act. Because God is never late. He just works in a way that we can't see. He molds, He prepares, He strengthens. But before the miracle comes the breaking point, the moment when there is nowhere left to run, where the only option left is total surrender. Think for a moment about Anna's story. She wanted a child more than anything, but the years passed and her answer never came. Her heart was tired, hurt by waiting, hurt by frustration. But it was at her point of greatest despair that she completely surrendered to God, in the temple, with tears. In her eyes, she cried out with such sincerity that Eli, the priest, thought she was drunk. But in that prayer, in that total surrender, God answered, and Samuel was born. The breaking point always comes before the response. With Hosea, it was the same. He was betrayed, sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned. For years, it seemed like everything was going in the opposite direction of the dream God had given him. But he remained faithful. And it was exactly at the most unlikely moment that God elevated him from prison to the government of Egypt. With Moses, it was no different. He led the people to the Red Sea, but suddenly the enemy was behind, and in front of him there was only water. In human eyes, there was no more hope. But it was precisely there, in the moment of greatest despair, that God opened the sea and made the impossible happen. And now, look at your life. What is your breaking point? In what area do you feel you have reached your limit? Are you about to give up, just at the moment when God is preparing the turnaround? Because the truth is that the miracle is already on the way. The response has already been sent. God does not ignore prayers. He does not forget promises. He does not close His eyes to sincere tears. But he has a different time than us, and often he allows us to reach the end of our strength so that we can finally trust him completely. And when that delivery happens, everything changes. The moment a heart surrenders completely to God, when it recognizes that there is no way out without him, there is no solution without his intervention, there is no life outside his presence, then the sky moves, because God never ignores a broken heart. Now, think about this. How many times have you almost given up, but God came and changed the game? How many times have you thought it was the end, but he proved it was just the beginning? If you've experienced something like this, share it in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to continue believing today. When everything seems lost, when there is no more strength to continue, and when the last hope seems to have been exhausted, it is exactly at this moment that God begins to act. Because God does not take us to the limit to destroy us, but to prepare us. What seems like a useless waiting time is actually a time of building. God never wastes pain, never ignores a cry, never abandons a child who trusts in him. What many don't realize is that before God transforms the situation, he transforms the heart. And that's why often the miracle doesn't happen when we expect it. Why God doesn't just take us out of the test, he teaches us within it. Remember the story of Lazarus. When Jesus received the news that he was sick, he did not immediately rush to cure him. To human eyes, it appeared that Jesus was delaying, but the truth is that he was not late. He was preparing an even greater miracle. When everyone thought it was too late, Jesus arrived and resurrected Lazarus. What seemed like the end was actually the greatest demonstration of God's power. Now think about your own life. How many times have you despaired because you thought God was taking time? How many times have you doubted, only to later realize he was working the whole time? Waiting time is not wasted time. It is a time of construction. While you pray and don't see answers, God is lining everything up. As you cry and feel alone, God is setting the stage for a powerful testimony. What you don't understand now will make sense later, and then something happens. Out of nowhere, an unexpected call, a message that changes everything, an opportunity you never imagined, and in that moment you realize God has always been in control because he is never late. He just works in a way that we can't see. Now I want to know, have you ever experienced a situation where it seemed like everything was lost, but God acted unexpectedly? Write in the comments your testimony, maybe just what someone needs to continue believing today. How many stories have you heard of people who were on the edge of the abyss with no more strength, no direction, believing that everything was over? And, at the last moment, did God intervene and completely change the course of history? This was no coincidence, it was purpose. God never acts without a plan. Every pain, every tear, every moment of waiting has a purpose much greater than we can understand. Maybe you've already been through this yourself, that moment when all the doors seemed closed, where there was no more hope, where no solution seemed possible. But then, suddenly, something happened, an unexpected call, an opportunity that came out of nowhere, a help that came when you no longer expected it. The story I'm going to tell you now is yet another living proof that God never fails, and he always acts at the right time. Lucas was a hard-working, dedicated man, someone who always believed that with effort and dedication, he could build a stable life. For years, he dedicated himself to his business, worked tirelessly, invested time and resources to grow. His company prospered, and he believed he was in control of everything. But without warning, a storm brewed. The crisis arrived suddenly. Customers disappeared, contracts were cancelled, and bills began to pile up. At first, he tried to remain calm. I believed it was just a phase, that everything would soon be resolved. But weeks passed, and nothing changed. Every day, the situation became worse. Lucas started to lose sleep, worry grew, fear took over, and anxiety became unbearable. He began to question God. Lord, why is this happening to me? I've always worked hard. I've always been honest. What did I do wrong? He tried everything. He sought loans, renegotiated debts, tried new investments, but nothing worked. The doors just wouldn't open. He saw everything crumbling before his eyes and felt like he was alone. The worst happened. He lost everything. His business went bankrupt, his savings ran out, and the last notification from the bank was the harshest of all. His house would be taken for lack of payment. Lucas looked at his family and felt a huge weight in his chest. How could he explain to his wife and children that in a few days they would no longer have a place to live? His heart broke. My God, why did the Lord allow this? The pain was unbearable. Despair took over. He locked himself in the room and alone fell to his knees. Crying like I've never cried before, he said a sincere prayer. Lord, I can't take it anymore. I tried everything, but nothing worked. I tried, I did my best, but now I don't know what to do anymore. If there is still a way out, show me. If there is still hope, give me a sign. I put everything in your hands. And it was there, at that moment of total surrender, which God began to act. The next day, something unexpected happened. The phone rang. It was a friend he hadn't seen in years. Lucas, I don't know why, but God put you in my heart today. How are you? Still overcome by tears, Lucas told his situation. Every detail, every struggle, every despair. His friend listened silently and, in the end, said something that would change his life forever. I just closed a big contract and I need someone I trust to manage a new project. Do you accept to work with me? Lucas couldn't believe it. After waiting for so long, after so many closed doors, God opened a way when he least expected it. The proposal not only resolved his financial crisis, but also restored his faith. He understood that the ordeal was necessary to bring him to a deeper level of trust. Lucas realized that God had never been silent, had never stopped listening. The answer was already on the way, but he needed to reach the point of total surrender, to understand that it wasn't about your strength, it wasn't about your strategy, it wasn't about your ability. It was about trusting God. This is not an isolated case. God acts like this all the time. Those who trust, who wait, who persevere, always see the glory of God manifesting itself in ways that no one can explain. Now look at your life. Maybe you are exactly where Lucas was. Perhaps you are waiting for an answer without understanding why God has not yet acted. But I want to tell you something very important. Your miracle is already on the way. God is already lining up everything behind the scenes. He is never late. He never makes mistakes. And now, I want to hear from you. Has God ever responded when you least expected it? Has he ever turned the tide when all seemed lost? Share your experience in the comments. Your testimony may be exactly what someone needs to hear today to keep believing. If today you are crossing a desert, facing a period of trial, waiting for an answer that doesn't seem to come, I want you to know something very important. God has never abandoned you, even if everything around you seems to indicate otherwise. Even if the silence seems unbearable, even if the pain has become a difficult weight to bear, what appears to be a void is now just the gap before the response. Waiting hurts. Waiting tests us. Waiting confronts us with our own fears, doubts, and insecurities. But waiting also teaches us to trust. God is never inactive. He is never absent. He never forgets. At the exact moment you think nothing is happening, God is behind the scenes, preparing every detail, organizing each piece of the puzzle, aligning everything so that your answer will come in perfect time. And I know, God's time is not always our time. He works differently. We want everything yesterday, but God teaches us to trust the process. We want immediate answers, but God shapes us during the wait. We want shortcuts, but God leads us along the path we really need to take. How many times do we look at difficulties and ask, Lord, why is this happening to me? But sometime later when we look back, we realize that Every moment of pain, every silence, every tear was part of a bigger plan that we could never have understood at the time. Remember Joseph? God gave him an incredible dream, but before seeing it come true, he went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and prison. He waited years and years. But when God finally exalted him, he understood that every pain was part of his preparation. What seemed like the end was actually the path to purpose. What if this is exactly what is happening to you today? What if this waiting is not a punishment, but rather training? What if this pain is not the end, but rather the beginning of something much bigger than you can imagine? The process is never easy, but it is necessary. Gold only becomes pure after passing through fire. Diamonds only form under great pressure. The tree only grows strong when its roots face the wind. And a child of God only becomes unshakable when he learns to trust, even without seeing. If today you are in the middle of the storm, remember, God never lost a battle. He always wins, he always acts, he always keeps his promises, and he is with you now. What do you need to do? Remain firm, even if the answer seems distant. Even if the days are difficult, even if you still don't understand, because what you don't understand now will make sense later. Your miracle is already on the way. And now I want you to do something. Write in the comments, I trust in God's timing. Declare it in faith, because he who trusts will see the glory of God. If this message touched your heart, if you felt God speaking to you through this word, then don't ignore this moment. Many people are going through trials, facing silent struggles and waiting for an answer. They need to know that God never fails and that waiting is never in vain. You can be God's instrument in reaching these people. Declare your faith now. Write in the comments, I trust in God's timing. Prophesy about your life, your home, your family. When we declare our faith, we are demonstrating that we do not depend on circumstances, but on the God who is above them all. Your testimony can strengthen someone who is on the verge of giving up. Often, a simple word can be just what someone needs to keep going. And don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel now to continue receiving messages of faith and powerful testimonies that will strengthen your spirit and renew your hope. Here, you will find words that edify, stories that prove God's actions, and content that helps you see his plans even in the most difficult times. Leave a like so that this message reaches more lives, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this word today. God is never late. He never makes mistakes and never abandons those who trust in him. Believe, because your miracle is already on the way. Now that you understand that God's silence never means abandonment and that waiting is part of the process, there is something even deeper that we need to reflect on. How do you know when God is about to act? Many times, God has already started to move the pieces, but we don't notice the signs. What seems like a delay may actually be preparation for something much bigger. But how to discern this? What is the evidence that the answer is closer than we think? In the next video, you will discover the spiritual signs that show that your miracle is coming and that God is already working in your favor. This revelation can completely change the way you see waiting time.